So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Robert Godin, who is our host for the evening.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for the introduction, and good evening, everyone. And really glad you're able to make it for what should be a really interesting and fun event. To get us started, there we go. I'd like to acknowledge that I myself, I'm currently situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation, who have been stewards of this land for time immemorial, which is very timely and topical for this event, because if, as a society, we would have kept doing as good a job as they have done, we wouldn't be having these different COP meetings. And I suspect a number of you are joining from the Vancouver region. And so the UBC Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And so today we have this event that's going to talk about the upcoming COP29, which is starting in November 11th, so 4 days from now, starting. So what is COP? Where does this come from? And there's a bunch of acronyms here, but trying to give you a sense of where does this all situate itself. So I hope everyone is familiar with the UN, United Nations. And the United Nations has different organizations within it or underneath the General Assembly, which have different mandates. So there's the World Meteorological Organization, the UNFCCC, for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there you go, and the UNEP, which is a UN environmental program. So these are the big UN organizations that are related in climate change and environment. And for example, these three, just give me a second to get a laser pointer, there you go. And these two organizations, they help form the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which makes these famous reports that every so often you hear about a new report that tells us really how dire the climate situation is. But one of the things that they also do is this COP, and COP standing for Conference of Parties. And parties, in this case, is countries, except the EU gets an additional seat. So there's 197 countries right now, plus the EU as 198 member. And if you look around, there's different COPs. There's been some on biodiversity. You might remember in Montreal in 2022, there was COP15, and that was the UN Biodiversity Conference. So a lot of these UN-based conference, they're called Conference of Parties, so they're all called COP. So sometimes you see the COP, in this case, COP29, which is the UN Climate Change Conference. So there's a lot of different COPs, and this one is the one that's really under the UNFCCC on climate change. And so I was fortunate myself to attend COP26 that was in Glasgow in 2021, which was a really high-profile COP. It was since COP21 in Paris in 2015. Every 5 years or so, the COP has a bit more importance because there's a bunch of mechanisms that kick in every 5 years about. So the COP26 in Glasgow was one of the big ones and had a high profile for, especially around the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. So Zarin, for you to get a sense of what COP is, here's a few pictures that I took while I was there. And there's different venues in the COP. And so this is what's called in the blue zone, which is where official observer and country-tied delegates can congregate. So there's a green zone, which is more of a public-facing outside the venue. And there's more restricted access to some of the higher profile negotiations, et cetera. But in this blue zone, there was this action zone here, which had a big globe on there and a bunch of chairs for people to come and talk. Because a lot of what COP really is about people networking together and coming and discussing different things. And so this was a kind of a central area. And then there were pavilions. So a lot of the pavilions were put up by a country, and where most cases they were showcasing the sort of work that they're doing in the climate aspect. There was others that were different organizations, not necessarily tied to a country, which were there to support countries to set up different programs or to attain different funding, or et cetera. And there was these small kind of sort of panel and meeting rooms where people would come and do announcement, or there'd be presentations that you could go and watch. So this is all happening in the blue zone. And as an observer, you also have access to the negotiation rooms or the meeting rooms. And this is one example. So this is where really some of the decisions are hashed out. This is where all the conversation that happens, and there's a bunch of parallel meetings that happen at a COP. And so there's a wide range of different topics that get discussed, but ultimately it's in rooms like this. And what was striking to me, and I'm curious if is striking to you, is like, this is small. Like we're talking about 197 plus countries trying to decide and agree on how are we going to go about our business in this changing climate. What are we going to do as a unified society, as countries who are helping each other? What are we going to do? What actions are we going to do? What targets are we going to put to ourselves? And not even every country can have a seat here. And so that's really a striking point about who gets a seat at the table really impact the sort of discussions that are happening. And this was, in this COP was particularly challenging because it was still during COVID restrictions. So the number of negotiators per country were limited. And you can see that there's a seat at the table and then there's a back row. So that each country who was in the meeting could have their lead negotiator at the table and have the little plaque that says their name, and behind them they could have one advisor, which as far as I understand is not a typical COP setting. Usually you can have a bit of a bigger team and there's a bit more space there. But these are the sort of rooms that these decisions get made in, and that there is definitely some issues related to that. But nevertheless, this is at least a place where you can get high-profile governmental individuals from multiple countries coming in and sharing their point, and hopefully getting the traction that is needed for change. And so, very broadly speaking, at a COP, there's three main topics on the agenda. One of them is mitigation. So mitigation being, how do we reduce the greenhouse gases emissions? This is where the nationally determined contributions also fit in. The nationally determined contributions was something that was put into the Paris Agreement. And that's has really big impact on how these COPs run now, because what it did is that it made every country responsible for the emissions that are generated within their borders. But what it excludes is any exports of fossil fuels or of things that will result in emissions. So for example, Canada, within its nationally determined contributions, does not put anywhere all of the coal products that gets exported to Asia. And that really makes a big a challenge for some countries. And how do these numbers get calculated, and what is your role in this, in the global stock take? And so countries, for example, like really strong exporters of fossil fuels, like Saudi Arabia, well, their nationally determined contributions is quite tiny, even though they're supplying such a huge amount of fossil fuels to other countries. But those will get counted within the border where it gets burned, which does little to prevent how much exportation there is happening of fossil fuels. So within mitigation, you'd also have some international transactions, like if you're doing carbon credits, and how do those go from one country to another. Then there's also adaptation. At this point, it's clear the climate is changing. How are we going to make different infrastructure requirements, change people's behavior, and how do we plan for the future within this future climate? And loss and damage is the third one, which is really taking, I'd say, more of importance over the last couple of COPs. And that's really in the context of there's been a big disconnect between where the emissions have been coming from, developed nations, global north, and who's really hardest hit by the impact of climate change, developing nations, global south, small island states. So how do we level the playing field there? What sort of contributions? It's generally accepted that the developed nations need to support developing nations, but how much and how is that going to get transferred? So the COP event is a 2-week event, and there's different thematic days on the different days. So these are this year's thematic days, and it's quite varied. But looking at what's been put on the agenda, one main theme that's really coming out of this upcoming COP is finance. And that's really in the, or set out from the Paris Agreement, the 2015 Paris Agreement, that there was going to be a new goal for climate finance in 2024. So that's now today. Because the original goal, which was back in 2009 in Copenhagen, I believe it was set as, was to raise $100 billion annually. And that has not been reached. That's been a complete failure. And the writing's been on the wall for a number of years. And now the estimates are something around $500 billion to $1 trillion a year would be needed. So this COP is being pegged as, okay, let's really figure this out and let's try to make this something that will happen, set a target that will be achievable. There's, of course, a lot of different and other things that will happen at the COP, but I wanted to give you just a really broad overview of what goes on in these meetings and how is it organized. So now I'd like to start introducing the panel, and I'm not sure if there's a different order, but I was going to go from the order on the website, which would be Carol, who I can bring up and invite to introduce themselves.
I think if it's okay, Robert, we'll go with the order from the other document, but we'll start with
okay.
Mark.
Yes, okay.
I'll
Mark,
do the list.
please.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Mark, take it away.
Sounds great. And yeah, thanks, Robert. And it's great to be here. So I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at UBC. My research interests are in environmental sociology, primarily looking at climate change politics, as well as stuff relating to that around energy and energy systems. And I'm currently working on my dissertation, which looks specifically at the COP process, mainly looking at how discourse coalitions of nation states and some other actors like NGOs and international organizations have changed over time throughout the COP process. So I'm going to go over kind of building on some of the stuff that Robert said about kind of how COP works, but more specifically kind of looking at some kind of recent important events, recent COPs, which will kind of help to generate some ideas about what we might be expecting at COP29. And yeah, Robert has mentioned some of these already, so it's great that I can just build on some of these things. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the Paris Agreement, because it's essentially now the primary negotiating mechanism that directs the COP process for nation states who attend these conferences, and essentially directs kind of their climate change policies. So Paris Agreement was established at COP21 in 2015, and a few kind of important things about how this works. So it's situated with what's called the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities Framework, which kind of directs the overarching UNFCCC convention, which was established in 1992. So this common but differentiated responsibilities idea is that all countries are kind of responsible for contributing to climate change and therefore also responsible for addressing it. But we also need to recognize kind of the different levels of responsibility that countries have for contributing to climate change, and also their different kind of capacities for responding to it, such as due to their like economic and political circumstances. And then kind of related to this, the Paris Agreement also builds on the nationally determined approach that was articulated under the Copenhagen Accord, which was established at COP 2015 or at COP 15 in 2009. So again, it kind of like favors this idea that like countries are all responsible, but we have different levels of responsibility. And so there's this idea of nationally determined contributions that countries kind of voluntarily come up with. But also another important aspect to the Paris Agreement is what they call a ratchet up mechanism. So even though countries are kind of responsible for setting their own emissions reductions targets, it is expected that these targets will get more and more ambitious over time. And part of the way that this is kind of facilitated under the Paris Agreement is what's called the global stocktake process, where essentially, I think it's once every 4 or 5 years or so, at the COP meetings, they have this kind of global stocktake where they review the kind of overall progress that's been made and the policies that countries are kind of talking about and their nationally determined contributions, and then kind of like encourage ideas for the next round of nationally determined contributions. So relating to this, so the first global stocktake actually took place at the last COP, which was in Dubai in 2023. This was COP 28. So kind of moving over to some of the other kind of important things that happened at COP 28. So in this first global stocktake agreement, and people have probably heard a bit about this, it received a lot of attention because it mentioned fossil fuels as the main driver of climate change in an agreement text for the first time, calling for a transition away from fossil fuels. So this is obviously a good thing. We could maybe question why this is it took so long to get to this point, but it's still a good thing. But it's kind of important to point out too that this was seen as kind of a controversial decision in various ways. On the one hand, there's a lot of people who, say this is like a really huge step that we're actually kind of acknowledging the main contributor to climate change being fossil fuels and that we need to kind of transition away from them. But on the other hand, other people say that this language saying like we need to transition away is too vague and not kind of specific enough. For example, we could have phrased it in terms of phasing out fossil fuels and be a bit more direct about when we're trying to do that. And then on the other hand, this is kind of other countries have kind of pushed back on this, mainly big fossil fuel producers, in terms of kind of push back on even mentioning fossil fuels at all. So important first step, but like pretty contested, even though we could see this as a good thing. But this is definitely something that we will be kind of seeing going forward, kind of talking about, even though, maybe this language is kind of vague, this is language that we can leverage going forward. So this will probably be talked about a bit more at COP29 and definitely future conferences as well. So a couple other things about COP28. It also operationalized a loss and damage fund, which Robert mentioned a little bit. So this was seen as a pretty big success at the beginning of COP28, where it operationalized this fund that was established at the previous COP. And in the process at COP28, a bunch of countries announced initial contributions to the fund. And then again, also Robert mentioned this a little bit, but another thing kind of coming up for COP29 relating to the finance area is this collective quantified goal on climate finance, which is due by the end of this year. So it's supposed to help provide finance for climate resilient development, as well as development for low greenhouse gas emissions, and is primarily intended to assist developing countries. So this is pretty important because it's supposed to kind of set the direction of climate finance for the next decade or so, and maybe even beyond that, and could also kind of help constitute an important step toward kind of accelerating just energy transition as well as adaptation action. Another couple things, I don't know a huge amount about this, and maybe other people do, but at COP28, they established the so-called Just Transition Work Program, which will be taken up a little bit more, I think, at COP29 and going forward. And parties will be discussing how to implement this. So this will kind of bring forward a range of issues from energy and the workforce to adaptation and participatory approaches in dialogue at the negotiations. And then another big thing, not necessarily at COP29, but shortly after, like the next round of nationally determined contributions is due, I believe, early next year. So at COP29, countries will probably be being encouraged to be ambitious about their next round of nationally determined contributions. Last thing I kind of wanted to close on, which, yeah, is not, yeah. So obviously, like with the US election result that's just come in, something I've been thinking about, as well as like I'm sure a bunch of other people working in the climate space, is how this is going to affect US climate policy. I think it's like highly likely that the US is going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement within the next few years once Trump is president again. I say this because, well, they've actually said that in the campaign that they're going to withdraw. And during his last term, he also withdrew from the agreement. And Biden kind of entered back into it again. So this is going to have some pretty big implications, obviously, not just for the US, but also for other countries' willingness to pursue climate action if they're kind of not seeing the US maybe be as serious about it. So that's something that is probably, again, like Trump isn't going to be in power during COP29 because it starts next week, but I imagine other countries will be thinking about this, and this might be discussed a little bit at COP29, but it's definitely something that's going to affect future negotiations. I'll say too, like it is possible if they do withdraw, it is possible again for the US to re-enter the agreement later on, but they do require approval by the US Senate, which will also be controlled by Republicans. So I don't think that's going to necessarily happen anytime soon if they do withdraw, but it is possible that they can re-enter. But that's kind of a big thing that I've been thinking about over the past day or two as well. So I'll leave it there.
Certainly something to keep tabs on and see how that develops. And thank you very much, Mark, for a great overview of all these different topics that it's around during COP or soon after. And next, I'd like to invite Tarun, who's going to be discussing the state of the energy transition globally and how this sets up the issues that will be addressed at this upcoming COP. Take it away, Tarun.
Thank you, Robert. It's been, for anyone who's looking in climate change, the US elections has been a crazy result to see and given us a lot to think about. But I want to sort of step back and just see what I can sort of contribute to this conversation. I work in energy and climate, intersection of energy and climate policy. So a lot of my work is in the electricity sector. I think, and I want to highlight a few just sort of, statistics. So why do we care so much about what happens in the energy or the electricity sector? So the energy sector roughly corresponds to about 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions that we have overall. Out of this, about 25% is just the amount. Greenhouse gas emissions are 25% are from generation of all the electricity that we need and we use. About 15%, another 15% is in transport, about 6% in buildings, and about 10% is what we call sort of emissions from fuel production. This includes, of course, both carbon dioxide emissions and also the methane emissions, which are also increasingly coming under spotlight. So COP28 was, and just to look back, where do we stand as of now? COP28 was quite a significant moment, right? There were, as Robert mentioned, for the first time, it was officially acknowledged that transitions away from fossil fuels is going to be required to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. But there were other sort of important pledges or key action points that were laid out. So some of the ones that relate very keenly to the energy sector are tripling the amount of renewable energy deployed by 2030, doubling the rate of energy efficiency by 2030, accelerating transition away from fossil fuels for all kinds of things, reducing methane emissions by 75% from 2022 by 2030, and accelerating phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. Now, these are some really important steps, and ideally, if we were to be able to meet these, we would be a lot closer to setting us up for a net zero pathway by 2050. So where do we stand? We've had some really good, moments or good numbers coming in from last year. So, for example, in 2023, the share of renewables increased dramatically in a number of countries. Renewables now accounts for more than 50% of electricity generated, for example, in Germany, more than 30% in China. In India, the investment in renewable energy for the first time actually surpassed investment in coal. So by the estimates from the International Energy Agency, we actually do not need any more investment in fossil fuels in the next decade. Given the expected reductions in energy demand, if we bring in more energy efficiency, we have enough fossil fuel infrastructure to provide a secure energy for the next few years, as long as we keep investing more in renewables. And investment in renewables is really what is going to, I think, be a key topic of discussion even in this year's COP. And where do we stand there? I think it's, for the first time, really nice to see that investment in renewables and solar actually is consistently outstripping investment in oil production and oil assets. Just to give you a context, in 2013, which is about 10 years ago, about $600 billion were invested in oil production, and only about $100 billion in solar energy. And in 2023, the numbers for oil actually came down, so about $400 billion was invested in oil, and there was actually a larger investment in solar energy. So that's actually great news. It's also, while the investments in oil and gas sector aren't really declining very fast, the investments in renewables are increasing quite rapidly. The sticking point, however, is that investments in renewables of all kinds and clean tech is happening mostly in the advanced countries plus China. So 90% of those investments. And what needs to happen, and that'll be a big feature of this year's COP, is how to scale this up to other countries. I'm going to take my cue and maybe stop here. And I'm going to leave for the discussion what does a Trump presidency and Trump economics means in achieving some of these emissions and what can be achieved at COP29 for the energy sector.
Thank you very much, Irving. Definitely, so those numbers are just mind-boggling. First of all, how much fossil fuel subsidies have there been, and that now, luckily, And thankfully, the solar and renewable subsidies are also ramping up to match that. So next up, I'd like to introduce Carol, who will be saying a few words on Paris Agreement Article 6 on cooperative mechanisms after she introduces herself.
Hi, everyone. So I'm a professor in food and resource economics at UBC Vancouver. My primary area of research is trade and environment. And so that ranges from the design of policies to reduce carbon leakage to developing metrics for investors who want to assess transition risk. So what I want to talk about today is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So this is a section on cooperative mechanisms. You've got section 6.2, which is on bilateral cooperation, and then 6.4, which is it's effectively about creating a UN governed market for carbon credit trading. And there's a hope that at COP29, the rules will finally be figured out to allow this market to operate. So carbon credits. So I'm an economist, and we love the idea that we're going to create markets to solve things. And carbon credits are it's an excellent idea in principle. And so the basic idea is it's expensive for me to reduce my emissions. It's cheap for you. So why don't I pay you to do some reductions? I've paid you, then I get to take the credit for the reductions that have happened. And then we just have a lower cost way of achieving the reductions that we want. And there is tremendous scope for contribution. So a number I came across today was if you had a carbon price of $30 a ton, and you looked at all the pasture land that you've got in Brazil, half of that, it would be more profitable to do reforestation than it would be to grazing cattle on it. So there's just a lot of room for there to be carbon credit trading. So to have one group do this mitigation and for other folks to pay them for it. And some of that mitigation could be really cheap. So we're looking at, for planting forests, $10 to $40 a ton. The downside or the problem is that credit trading is in practice very fraught. So I'm going to go back to Brazil for an example where things didn't work out well. There were companies that were selling credits to big corporations like Boeing and Air France. But the folks who were selling the credits didn't actually have the authority to undertake the mitigation, the reforestation, because half of the projects were on public lands. And so this came up because this was a lawsuit. But those credits that Boeing and Air France were purchasing, those were certified. They were certified by Verra, which is the dominant third-party certifier. And even if you go to certification not from the market, but to organizations like the UN, there have been problems. So I think Leslie's going to put a link in the chat to a really interesting paper on blimps, so blatantly inframarginal projects. And what these folks did was they looked at wind farms that had been built in India and then looked at the ones that had been certified for credits for offsets that they were allowed to sell them under the clean development mechanism. And what they found was of the ones that they had a direct comparator for, they found that over half of the projects that were certified would have been built anyways. So they should never have been allowed to have been selling credits. And these were projects that were certified by the UN. There are lots of stories like this. I am sure there are, and I'm very confident, hopeful, that there are lots of stories where there are real actions that are being taken. But there's a lot of stories in which we don't trust the credits. And so you're seeing in the market kind of dropping off. So we've seen the amount of credit trading since 2023, the credit trading has dropped by half. And there's a common perception now that carbon credits that don't come from DACs, which is direct air carbon capture and storage, that these are not trustworthy, they're garbage. But DACs are really expensive. So we're looking at $600 to $1,000 a ton. There's a hope that those prices can come down to like $100 a ton. And so if you were going to get to ask me, is like, if you got one thing that comes out of COP, and it's weird for me as an economist to say this, it would be a hope that they don't agree to have countries use carbon trade credits that you get at least from non-DAX projects to count towards their nationally determined contributions. Carbon trading is a brilliant idea, but right now we just don't have confidence in the verification. And so I think maybe let companies use these things for marketing purposes, but don't let countries count them towards their obligations.
Thank you very much, Carol. That is indeed a really important point. And DAX, yeah, you hear about them more and more. And one bit I saw on DAX is that if we would do everything on DAC, we could, yeah, reach net zero, but about 25% of our water use globally would be supporting DAX only. That's huge. It's huge. Yeah, feasibility seems a bit low. Thank you very much. So next I'm going to introduce, let Bashar introduce himself. And Bashar has attended multiple COPs. And so really, how has COP shaped your perspective on climate action?
Hi everyone, my name is Bashar. I'm originally from Bangladesh, currently studying international economics at UBC here on Musqueam territories. It's important for me to acknowledge this land and reflect on the lasting impacts of colonialism, both here and in many places around the world. Colonial projects have left legacies of extraction, displacement, and inequity, an impact that persists within our institutions and across international systems. We vividly see these consequences today in places like Palestine, where colonial structures have systematically undermined the rights and lives of communities, perpetuating cycles of dispossessions. As scholars like Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, Nobel laureates of economics this year, have shown the imprints of colonialism endure in institutions worldwide, shaping economies, governance, and even the ability of communities to respond to crises like climate change. I wanted to acknowledge this bit of history because we see that disparity in spaces like COP. In my experience of being very privileged to attend two COPs, one in Dubai and the other one in Egypt, I've seen this disparity firsthand. Representation heavily skews towards delegation from wealthier historically colonial nations, while those from the countries most impacted by climate change struggle to be heard. And you see that when you're walking in the halls, you see that when you're in a forum in different discussions. And this disparity is not just within nations, but also within different demographics. There's a brilliant carbon brief article, which I'll share after I finish my brief intro. And you can see how, like there's big gaps between gender, there's big gap between like who attends COP in terms of political and non-political spaces, academic and non-academic spaces. And that really affects what are the things that are brought in these discussions in different forums. And on one hand, COP is a place of immense potential. I was there, I was very excited to see nations, organizations, and communities come together with a shared commitment to address climate change. But also on the other hand, it's also a space where limits of progress become all too clear. For every step forward, there are like thousands of obstacles, political, economic, and institutional, that slow the pace of meaningful action. It reminds you that climate crisis is complex, spanning scientific, economic, and political dimensions, but it's also very human. And there's a lot of things that can be said about that. My home country, Bangladesh, stands as a stark example of resilience in the face of overwhelming climate hardship. And I've seen those communities. I spent a summer just interviewing different people around my country, different demographics, because I realized that the representation that comes from Bangladesh were mostly people from the capital, who were in many discussions very detached from what was happening in different parts. And so was I, as someone who studies in UBC and lived in UBC for 3 years. So I didn't think my voices or my representation meant anything for Bangladesh. So my friend and I, we spent a summer cycling across Bangladesh, capturing different stories of communities. And we presented that, we put it together as a documentary film and presented that at the next COP in Dubai. And finally, I think what I wanted to share was that climate change is going to be there, and a lot of things, particularly that happens in spaces like North America, has strong implications for my country, and it makes me very concerned and worried. But I think even at COP, I had that feeling of, these like the feeling of fear, the feeling of hopelessness. But sometimes you speak with one person, you speak with one individual who spent all their life working on this issue, and you get energized. And I think it's now more than ever we need that energy, we need that empathy, we need that respect, the idea of equity. And I just wanted to echo that, which I've heard from many folks who have been on this fight for more than I have, and keep that in our heart and soul.
Thank you very much, Bashar. Definitely, I've felt that demoralization after a week of COP. The news is big. There's a lot of worrisome things, but you're right. There's a lot of energy still, and there's people doing it for a very long time. Thank you very much, Bashar. And so now, for the last member of the panel, I'd like to introduce Simon, who is going to talk a bit about what other aspects of COP should we be looking for this year.
Oh, thanks so much, Robert. And it's wonderful to Bashar to follow your important comments and context. I'm a scientist here at UBC, and I've had the good fortune to sort of work on as a scientist, but also sort of on the border of science and policy. So I've been following COP events since before I moved here to UBC 15 years ago. I worked at a school of public and international affairs beforehand, even though I'm a scientist. And so that kind of gave me this introduction to the international climate space. But another piece happened is that as a result of my scientific research, I've done work in the small island developing states of the Pacific for a long time. That's almost about 20 years now. And as a result, that research, began as science, but led into thinking about and talking to people in the Pacific Islands, our colleagues and everything, about the big questions around adaptation and finance. One of the pillars, concepts of the whole UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that leads to these meetings is that the developed world, that's the United Nations language, it should be helping the developing world, again, UN language, respond to climate change. And Mark at the beginning talked about, and Robert as well talked about the finance goal that's been set. And so I thought I would just go into a couple of the details of the things that are going on at this COP that falls out of this. So because of this original tenet of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the world's governments did agree a number of years ago that they would aim to mobilize $100 billion per year to help the developing world, and that they would do that by the year 2020. And the most common misconception about this is that it's like that the $100 billion is a fund. It's really an accounting exercise, because the idea is that the money shouldn't all flow through the United Nations. They did create something called the Green Climate Fund that would be kind of like a World Bank for climate change adaptation and mitigation in the developing world. But really what it is that trying to account for all of the different ways in which money may flow from the developed world to the developing world to help respond to climate change. And that could include loans, it could include grants, through direct aid, like direct aid from Canada to another country. It could be bilateral, it could be multilateral, and it also could include private investment. And so it's pretty complicated to account for, right? And it also, the most complicated part is that the idea is that we would not want this type of funding to just be a shift of money that is already part of the international development apparatus. So the money was supposed to be new and additional to development aid. So you can imagine how hard it was to account for. So the goal was not met by the year 2020, but by the year 2022, the OECD says that there was $116 billion flowing. So the question is it the type of money? Is it in the type of, and is it going to the right places, et cetera? That's what's complicated. Because again, this is like an accounting exercise. 80% of that money was public funds, bilateral and multilateral funds, but the vast majority of it went to mitigation. And so the question sort of before this COP, there's an agreement by the end of this year that they're supposed to come up with what the next goal is. And the debate isn't just about the total amount of money. It's about how should we think about it? Should it be an annual total? Should it be a cumulative total over time? And should there be sub-goals? So should it say that some fraction has to go to adaptation? Because until now, the vast majority of the funding, well over around 80% or so, really goes towards mitigation in the developing world. But if you think about the fact that many countries in the global south are much less responsible for climate change, the thing that the developed world should be helping with is responding to the impacts that is being caused by our emissions in this part of the world. So the question is, will there be sub-goals specifically for adaptation? That's one of the things being negotiated. And the other one is just who is contributing towards this international climate finance, and who is receiving. Back when all of this was dreamed up like 30 years ago, when they first started talking about it, there was a clear definition between developed and developing, and there was a clear list that the UN could use. Now the question is, well, what do we think about rapidly industrializing countries that may have the means, but are still technically considered developing? That includes countries like China and many others. Should they might not be expecting to receive funds, but they also might not be expecting to give any. And so that's where the tough part of this negotiations will be. Together with this, there's also something called the Global Goal on Adaptation that's being negotiated right now. Adaptation is something that's very context specific, so it depends on the individual country and individual community what's needed. And so really what they're negotiating here is saying we want each country to put together an adaptation plan, and we want them all to use the same indicators in those plans so they're comparable and countries can help each other. And the one extra piece I'll just add is at the very beginning, both Robert and Mark, I think, referred to loss and damage. As we heard, this idea of a fund to help, not for adaptation, not for mitigation, but to help pay for damages that have already occurred due to climate change. So a separate category was finally established after much fighting about it at two conferences ago. And the question now is about the details. How are countries going to access those funds? And are people going to pledge more? And that'll be on the agenda a bit this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Those are indeed very big questions, and we'll see how it plays out. So thank you very much, everyone on the panel, for the introduction and talking about some of the topics that really you're thinking about for this upcoming COP. So now we're going to move to the Q&A period of this, and seeing a few more questions pop up. There was a reminder in the chat, but if you have questions, so please submit them through the Q&A, depending what your client is. For me, it's at the bottom. There's a little Q&A box there, and you can upvote questions that you find are interesting, so we get to them first. Depending how it is, we'll see, but I'd like to ask the panel to keep answers brief so that we can go through all the questions, and then if we have more time, we can circle back to it. So to get us started, I think a question that will surprise no one, a question about the US. So do we really need the US for any of this? Or, could it be worthwhile to carry on without them? And how would that look like? Not sure if maybe Mark, you want to take a first stab at this. You mentioned US and things you've been thinking about there.
Yeah, like I'll say, so first say, like, obviously it'd be better if they were in it, so they're actually contributing to climate change mitigation, as well as like the US just kind of being a global leader and a major contributor to climate change. So it kind of discourages other countries if they withdraw. I'll maybe post this article in the chat from The Guardian that I just saw. So I can send this to everyone. It's basically, it was actually a few days before the election, but it's like the UN, I forget what position he has, but Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, essentially saying that if they do withdraw, like the Paris Agreement and negotiations can continue, but in his words, it would like severely cripple the Paris Agreement process. Probably for reasons I just said, but ultimately, yeah, it's hard to say exactly what will happen, but I wouldn't say it would be good. But yeah, maybe turn it over to other people for their thoughts too.
So,
Yeah,
oh,
thank you.
yeah, I guess there's we can't wait around for them. They're gonna keep on not doing enough, and we can't wait for them to sort out their political situation. And so there are things that countries can do. So one of the things that the EU is doing is putting in border carbon adjustments. And so if American companies who are shipping stuff to the EU, if those companies are not paying a carbon price, then they're going to have to pay that on the goods that they're shipping to the US. Other countries could start adopting similar policies. The US is huge, but they, so collectively are the other countries around. And so there are things that we can do to encourage them to participate.
I can talk a little bit about what's the impact going to be on the energy sector, right? So, and I've been thinking about it also in terms of what it means for the US domestically and what it means for the wider world. So I actually had this moment where I was like, but there are some facts, right? So fact is, in the United States, energy generated from coal has consistently gone down in the last 10 years. And this is in spite of the fact that Trump was sort of like a champion of the coal mining industry at the beginning. It's also noticeable that in this election cycle, like he has been considerably muted about coal mining. It's a lot been like drill, baby, drill, but not so much about we are going to keep coal alive forever. And part of that is just economic reality. Coal is being outcompeted by renewables in the US. What would change is the massive push that was given by the Biden administration under the Inflation Reduction Act to all kinds of clean tech, including renewables. And part of it is, there are two aspects to it. One of it, some of it has already been spent and you can't undo it. A lot of it is already in the process of being spent in constituencies in a lot of Republican states, so in the Midwest, and it's unlikely, that's the general sort of wisdom, that it's unlikely or less likely that a lot of it will be completely rolled back either. So there will be definitely an impact in the US domestically, but part of it is cushioned in some sense by the way the US climate policy has worked in the last 4 years during the Biden administration, which is by throwing a lot of money at clean tech rather than by creating things like carbon taxes, which can be reversed. And internationally, I think the bigger impact would be, I think, on a few things. One is the US trade policy, which might impose all sorts of tariffs on everything, but also on things like electric vehicles and what that means for the global industry in this respect. And we've talked a lot about about funding mechanisms from developed to developing world. I think that would definitely, you can easily see that the US is not going to support any of those transfers anymore, at least at the federal level. I think that would have clear ramifications on the amount of money required for scaling up renewables in the developing world. As I mentioned, most of the investment that has happened in the last 5 years, and those big numbers that I talked about, it was advanced countries plus China. And about $100 billion were being spent in the US alone every year. Now you remove the US from the equation, and what we need is at least seed money to scale up this kind of financing in the developing world, where capital cost of doing this financing in any case is higher. So without the US, that is going to get more difficult, and that would and we can't really sort of avoid that negative consequence at this point.
Yes. Yes, it will definitely have a lot of far-reaching impact, which is hard to predict at this point. Thank you. So the next question is, what kind of transparency mechanisms exist, and especially like briefly touching on nation equity? So what's out there in terms of transparency?
I'm happy to speak to this a little bit, just based on the technical side of everything. Listen, the UN climate summits get beaten up a lot for very good reason of what has not been accomplished over the years. I will say one of the biggest accomplishments of this is that thanks to the UN climate summits and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, we know what everybody's emissions are. And while the accounting isn't perfect, that was one of the #1 things that they aimed for at the beginning. And so we do have the sort of transparency around emissions that did not exist really before this. But I'll tell you that like everything else, this has to be negotiated. So there is a whole transparency and compliance set of negotiations that is about what exactly are we supposed to report. So each country is supposed to do these biennial transparency reports. They're due at the end of this year. I think the next ones are. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about at COP29 is literally what needs to be in them. And so I didn't even realize this, but I just was talking to some folks about this recently. It sounds like the countries struggle to agree on the topics that they need to present. The data, that's all done. There's a whole system for that. But on the topics that need to be in their kind of transparency reports, the countries fight about the topics, and they fight about the timelines of all of this. And the reasoning isn't actually bad. Listen, it's just countries have different priorities. Some of them are focusing more on reducing emissions in one sector than the other. There can be obvious reasons for that, related to how dependent the country is on different types of fossil fuels, et cetera. But what happens is they're afraid about getting singled out, not just because of their emissions, but being singled out because the timeline is set a certain way. And then they're late submitting their report because of internal government things. And then they look bad internationally because they submitted the report late. So it really is, it's kind of like almost just like managing like an assignment in class. It is very familiar for those of us that teach classes here at UBC. So.
Yes, they got to do their homework. Each country has to do it. Did anyone want to touch on nations equity topic? Maybe Bashar, if I can put you on the spotlight on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there are some financial incentives just on the transparency side, like different multilateral organizations seem to favor projects that align more with climate goals, which encourages sometimes. However, I'm not gonna say that it's totally equitable, because oftentimes geopolitical tensions tend to decide a lot for which countries receive climate funding for what projects. And I've personally seen that in the context of Bangladesh. And I can also say that even when there are other concerns as well from a equity perspective, all of the $100 billion Green Climate Fund, Bangladesh receives $1 billion in adaptation fund. And most of this $1 billion goes to this one organization called PKSF, Polli Kormo Songstha Unnayan Foundation. It's a government entity. And Bangladesh was ran by a dictator for the last 15 years. So a major portion of this fund would be lost in quote unquote supply chain. So there are big concerns for players like World Bank, GCF to have these in consideration when they're funding projects. But I've also noticed, I've had conversations with BRAC, Codec. These are some of the largest NGOs in Bangladesh, and they're yet to receive any climate funding from the UNFCCC process in Bangladesh. So that was very weird to hear. But what there are organizations like USAID, Zika. They have a lot of collaborative projects with them. So at the end of the day, when it comes to nation equity on equity lens, it's challenging sometimes because there are governance loophole in different places. But I think those things are also changing. You know, there are better models in place that allows you know, countries to get more climate funding who needs it. But then again, it's not perfect. It's not a perfect system.
Thank you, Bashar. Next question we have is, has there been any global efforts made to count the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted in wars and conflicts? That's a question. I don't know the answer to this, actually. I'm curious. Does anyone here?
I'm happy to just quickly say, I wish I knew, Hanura, I wish I knew had the data with me. I have seen papers that have done this, not like research studies. I don't recall anything that did it globally, but they tried to study it for individual individual conflicts. But it is a very good question. My understanding is that it is very hard to include military emissions in the actual national like emissions inventories, the official ones. And so it's possible this stuff doesn't really get properly accounted for when countries account for their greenhouse gas emissions. And I also think it would be politically very complicated to include it as well, as much as we should.
I have a couple thoughts on that too. Maybe doesn't directly answer the question, but so one of the professors in sociology department at UBC called Andrew Jorgensen, it's just kind of him and some of his colleagues have started a little bit of a research program kind of looking at stuff that's related. So I just posted the name of an article here called Guns versus Climate, How Militarization Amplifies the Effect of Economic Growth on Carbon Emissions. So it doesn't directly get at that. I think in the article, they're more not so much measuring conflict as like the amount of kind of soldiers and equipment countries have and how that drives emissions. But I will say there might be stuff there might be other literature in the article that kind of touches on that. But yeah, I would imagine it's probably pretty difficult to measure that stuff too, though, for conflicts.
Great, thank you. Next question. So really, how meaningful are these COP resolutions? So is there any mechanisms, informal structures or pressures to enforce that the different countries follow what they've actually agreed to, especially the ones with more economic power?
I can briefly touch on that. A lot of the things that we see at COP are non-binding. So it's definitely, you know, there's an element of voluntary nature of these commitments. So sometimes, as we saw Trump pulling out of the Paris Agreement back in 2017, obviously, like, you know, a lot of countries with strong economic power are able to do that if needed. But I think the reason I'm still hopeful about a lot of things related to COP commitments is because it creates a global pressure, not just in the form of like, you know, if some country steps out, then other countries double their efforts. Just addressing like, you know, elements of the first question. When Trump went out of the Paris Agreement in 2017, European Union launched a European Green Deal in 2019, and China also, I think, wanted to maximize wanted to reach their peak emission in 2030 instead of a year that was farther ahead. So, you know, when US was like not doing things as they should, other countries stepped up because there is a global sense of urgency. So all that is to say that when political parties, when elections determine what stances these political parties are going to take, it is true, it is very non-binding, but still the global sense of urgency sometimes more often than not creates pressure, and that leads to more climate action. So I want to stay optimistic on that note.
Maybe I can just add to that. I think I would broadly agree. I remember during I think it was the last COP, the one before that, when the Indian Prime Minister announced a net zero target for 2070 for the country, and from everyone that I know who works at Indian Energy, it was basically took everybody by surprise. It was not very much a pre-planned target that had come up. It seems that it was during the negotiations in COP and sort of some pressure from the Biden administration that India was supposed to set a date. But it has, in some sense, catalyzed action. Right? So in the energy community within India, the people I know, there's now all this sort of concentrated effort in mapping out decarbonization pathways by 2070. So while countries can always not meet these targets, and there's no sort of binding mechanism, no penalty mechanism, it does catalyze action, does focus action in a way that is helpful for all sorts of efforts that are going around it. So I think there is merit in these declarations.
Yeah, if I can make a small comment myself, I think this is overall a political game. So other countries will take note if they're not doing their part within the COP and within the Paris Agreement, and that will in fact impact inter-country relations when discussing other fronts. And just on this topic, I think follow-up question. So really how valuable, and touched on this a little bit, but how valuable are these commitments, especially in the context of these election cycles, that we're doing these decade-long targets and election cycles for a year, and the lack of enforcement mechanism. So really we'll maybe a bit deeper in what's the value in these really where we have differences in the timelines.
I'm happy to just say something quick about that. I think I'm with everyone here that can be frustrated by targets being set and then not being met. It's challenging at the same time internationally to create something binding, right? I like to say that we don't really have a world government. My political science colleagues will sometimes argue with me saying you can consider the United Nations a form of world governance, but it's not governance in the sense that we think of it, in that they have control over what's going on domestically within the country. And so there are probably no countries in the world that would be okay with having their greenhouse gas emissions target be binding towards the international community such that you could be penalized if you didn't meet it. Because in order to meet it, it's about your energy system, your economy, and all these sorts of different things. And so countries don't want to give up their sovereignty. I don't think there's a country in the world that would be okay with that. So that's why we got sort of stuck in this place of these voluntary targets that we need to sort of get towards. And then it just becomes a debate within each country of this balance between feasibility and ambition. I'll say the one thing that's been interesting in Canada and a little bit in the US is that targets that have been set by previous governments, when the government changes, going back sort of between liberal and conservative, and to some degree even between Democrat and Republican, they haven't necessarily removed the greenhouse gas emissions targets, the national ones. I imagine the Trump administration, if they pull out of Paris, that effectively kills their target because it gets rid of their commitment to Paris. But Canada, the Harper, when Canada's governments have turned over, the targets have actually stayed. If anything happened, they just increased it, which is what the Trudeau government did. So, some of these things are able to stick over time. I think the bigger issue is this question of how do you want to balance feasibility and ambition. I think most of us on this call want countries like the one we live in here to be ambitious, but there's a risk also if you set a target that's incredibly ambitious that might be hard for the country to meet. It makes people cynical about the actions happening in the country, and Canada's sort of going through that right now, to be honest.
Thank you, Sam. I have a question that I'll direct to Carol on carbon credits. So financing systems, like in the form of loans, it seems to be putting developing nations on long-term debts. And so, and also carbon credits and taxations are being shifted to the consumers, who's going to foot the bill at the end. So how does that help hold the polluters more accountable at the end of the day?
I'm gonna start with the second one since one of the things that when we tax consumers or we tax producers, if everybody in the system is facing those taxes, all producers, then they're going to shift some of those costs onto consumers. And vice versa, if all the consumers are facing the tax, then the companies are going to have to either reduce their emissions or lose some of their sales as consumers see their prices rise. And so, to some extent, putting a tax on consumers is still going to hurt companies and incentivize them to do stuff to reduce their emissions because they're going to lose sales. Because if the price of my product goes up by 100%, I'm not going to buy as much. So even though I may be the one, that the tax is being collected at the till, when I purchase something, the company is still going to suffer from that. That's true if everybody is participating. One of the problems that's quite famous is if we tax, say, producers here in Canada, but we are importing stuff from other countries that don't pay a carbon price, then consumers get to bypass the local taxes by just buying the thing that was produced overseas. And so this is actually why countries are thinking about going to border carbon adjustments, because then it means that anything consumed in Canada, the customer is still having to pay the tax, even if it was produced in a country that didn't have a carbon price itself. So it's not that polluters get exempt when the consumer pays as a tax. It still gets shared, but it's just kind of who sends a check to the government. But we do still have this very thorny issue of how do we deal with imports and exports from countries that do and don't have carbon pricing.
Thank you very much, Carol. And next question. So what are the bases of selecting countries on COP negotiations? So who gets the chance to get involved in making the highest level decisions? And why are past decisions not binding?
I can take that one.
Leadership.
So all countries that are parties to the UNFCCC framework, currently I think around or over 190 nations are eligible to participate in COP. But since it's a lot of people in the room, there are like groups set that represent concerns of some countries together that allows more streamlined discussion. So there's a coalition called Small Island Developing States, which represent all the countries most vulnerable to climate impacts. Then there's least developed countries, LDC, often highly climate vulnerable nations with very few resources. And then there's European Union, G77 and China. G77 and China is a coalition of developing nations advocating for equity. So these groups together, they engage in different conversations, and at the end of the day, I think there is a power of who has more capital that decide a lot of these decisions, and not just capital, but like influence in a region. For example, in South Asia, India has the biggest military and also the biggest GDP, so they get to be more dominating than countries like Bangladesh in South Asia. So and also for in North America, US has more say in things than Canada and Mexico, and you see that in South America as well. So those are the ones who make those decisions. And the second part of the questions, why are these decisions non-binding, uh, are not binding? I think it's at the end of the day, all of these countries are sovereign. They decide on their own policies. They decide on their own way of dealing with things. So UNFCCC actually are not able to like truly enforce anything, but they can always call out or like, you know, put it out there that this country is not meeting their requirements, and then sometimes private sector or other actors can, you know, take chances or like, you know, do things that incentivizes countries to take steps. So there are multitude of reasons why we can't make it binding. And I think as someone who's from a developing country, I like it. I really don't want it to be binding because it really puts a lot of pressure, particularly in developing countries. Because when it comes to climate commitments, a lot of funding right now, even today, is loan based. And you know, it's if things become more binding, then there can be more pressure on developing countries than developed countries because of how the world order is and because of how politics is right now. Yeah. I'll stop there. If anyone else has to share anything more, I'd love to hear.
No, then we can go to the next question. And so, has thought been given as to how to hold oil and gas companies responsible for some of the funds that are required in order to deal with the impacts of this? I think everyone can direct that to you.
Yeah, I can get started, and then I'm guessing others will also want to chime in on this one. So there have been many proposals in the current. So there are two. So there's some mandatory levies, and then there are some voluntary ones. So the current presidency actually in Baku has proposed, I think it's called a voluntary oil fund. I'm missing the exact name. But it essentially a fund which will be funded by oil and gas companies on a voluntary basis, which can be used for all kinds of mitigation, adaptation, research, and development. Yeah, I think it's called Climate Finance Action Fund, right? It has been in operation a while, and it's been again pushed by the COP presidency in COP29. Some of these kind of voluntary measures are sort of controversial, right? Because they tend to be very small. So I think the amount of money raised so far has been quite insignificant. It also tends to water down what's been the sort of actual required contribution from foreign fossil fuel industries. The other aspect is there have been many proposals to, and some of them internationally, to put for example, a small carbon tax on all oil production internationally, and use those carbon tax revenues to fund all kinds of climate mitigation activities and adaptation and loss and climate fund throughout. So there are many proposals on the table like that. And some of these mechanisms do exist. So for example, and I didn't know this till recently as well, but for managing oil spills, there does actually exist a fund, which is an automatic fund where revenues are raised by taxing all oil tankers that move around the oceans. So this was created, I think, somewhere in the 60s when the first oil spills happened. And it was recognized that ultimately all countries have to pay for this, and there should be an automatic mechanism to raise revenue. And that's, I think, the important point, that any of these activities, the best way to do it is an automatic levy that raises money on an ongoing basis. Because every time we have these voluntary contributions that needs to come from governments and government budgets, it's going to be subject to all kinds of political negotiations every year in every country, whereas a small levy, which is somewhere much more automatic, tends to escape scrutiny as much in election cycles, but which is kind of what you want as well.
Thank you. I think we'll do one last question. We'll see how quick it is, and if we do get comments afterwards. But there's a lot of official activities and negotiations that happen at the COP. but there's also a lot of things that are outside of that. So what's the value or the benefit of the activities that happen outside the big official negotiations?
I can speak to that. Oh,
Please go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
okay. Well, for one thing, it's just important for just raising awareness of climate change being an issue, and as well as so for one thing, just like when COP is going on, like climate change becomes a lot more salient in the media, so people are just more aware of that type of stuff. Another thing, like I and some of my colleagues do a bit of research kind of looking at how, relating to what I just said, but also looking at kind of how social movement and civil society actors kind of, even if they're not like in the negotiations, like for example, there's sometimes like a lot of protests that take place outside of the event, where people are either trying to like influence what's going on in it or just raise awareness or promote certain issues and stuff like that. So
I think I can just add that these negotiations, they don't happen during that week. They're year-longs. There's so much lead up to it. And even outside of COP, there's yearly climate conference in Bonn that serves as kind of a lead up to COP, where people bring their topics there and kind of prepare for COP. So there's a lot that they draw on when, you know, the final, you hit the road and you try to get a paper that's consensus agreed upon. So we have 5 minutes left. I think we have a little bit of time if people have some final parting thoughts they want to share before we fully close it out. So goodbye. It's like you wish. Not going to force anyone to say anything, but here's your last opportunity.
I can start.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that we must recognize that climate change does not exist in isolation. It intersects deeply with issues of global stability and conflict. And climate-induced resource scarcity, whether it's water shortage or agricultural decline or other form of environmental stress, has intensified tensions in regions where they're already facing social and political instability, like Yemen, Sudan, Palestine. And we just need to keep that in mind when we're talking about climate action, because, it only happens when we have peace and stability, especially when it comes to places like that.
I'll add one, which is there's times that you can hear everyone on this panel there's some optimism, some disappointment, and we should remain pessimistic, but we shouldn't give up. And so the COP do achieve some things, not as much as nearly as we would all like, and so we should always be trying to be creative about thinking about what are other things that we can do in addition, so we don't give up on COP or the UNFCCC, but we should also be thinking about what else can we add, how can we make this easy for our political leaders, for the electorate, for companies, to try to do meaningful action. So we should always be searching out new and creative ways to start adding to the set of solutions.
I'll just add a quick thing. Honestly, climate change is like the largest collective action problem in like the history of humanity, pretty much, right? And I think the COPs are disappointing in part, it's not the only reason, but in part because we set the bar too high for them, right? With the decisions that are being made around climate change, particularly around reducing emissions, if they were made in a top-down way, it would really deprive, it would sort of go against the principles of democratic governance and deprive people of decisions. Like if governments just made clear decisions, if the international community and governments made decisions about saying, okay, that's it, we're dropping this form of energy, we're picking up another one, it's going to have real impacts on communities around the world. And so there might actually be good reasons that you can't have an international summit like this that easily, you know, come out with like a treaty and it'll just solve the problem. And one of the challenges is that the whole structure of the climate summits is based on and draws from how we dealt with the ozone challenge of the depletion of the ozone layer. So it was designed off the same framework, but the difference there was the causes of the depletion of the ozone layer was a particular set of gases that are purely human-made that didn't exist in nature, and alternatives existed. And climate change is really fundamentally a different challenge. And so this, I always look at COP as just, it's important because of the scale of this problem that countries are getting together and talking about it. And I wish more could happen, but maybe the fact at least that we're getting a sense of where they are and is valuable in its on its own. So very low bar in my mind.
Well, on that, I'd like to thank you all, the panelists, and I'll turn it over to Leslie for a final wrap up, but we're unfortunately out of time. I think there will be, our contact info would all be shared around, so you can get in touch and we can continue this discussion outside of this event. But thank you very much for attending and for the wonderful, stimulating questions.
Thanks so much. And Tarun, I see you unmuted. Did you want to have a quick word?
Oh, I was going to just share this fun little thing that I found out. There is the Royal Shakespeare Company in the UK has created a play called Kyoto. It's on COP negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol. And I think that's great because I actually have friends who have no idea what COP is, and it's very hard for me to get them interested in something as in some sense which is so sector specific as this. And I think it's great that somebody's created a theater production out of it and they really emphasize that it's ultimately also a human drama what happens in COP. It's not just about countries and their big negotiating positions and big ideals. It's about people and real people in room who are starving for 3 days and have to negotiate on this piece of paper. And there's some important people who play outsized roles. So yeah, I mean, share with people who you don't think know about this. I put the link in chat.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And that is a great reminder. Thank you everyone for participating today and for submitting your questions. I did just want to direct you to our event website that we have on the Climate Solutions Research Collective website. We try to share events that are happening with respect to climate that are from units across UBC and beyond. So if you are interested in climate activities that are happening in person or online that you could attend either in Kelowna or in Vancouver, please check our events. In particular, we have just sent out a save the date for a climate conversation we'll be hosting in person in Vancouver on the 25th of this month with respect to the youth-led climate litigation in the Mather appeal in Ontario. And we'll have Professor Stephen Wood leading that conversation. So check out our website for more information.